Thank you, QED, for inviting me. First, I'm just going to make sure I can use the technology. I'm a bit of a Luddite, so I might be going backwards. Okay, I'm going forwards. Right, so I'm going to go over a few of the discussion points that we talked about, plus the transitional period, which I think is huge. And I think Joe touched on the transitional period and also the definition of regulated benchmarks. Those two issues are gigantic. And I take Uwe's point that we've got to come up with practical solutions, but we sort of have to come up with them very soon because we are not 100 miles from the cliff that we're running towards. We're 2 meters. And benchmark providers, especially those that are big ones, that have lots of indexes, MSCI, if you don't know about us, we're calculating indexes for over 40 years. We calculate over 190,000 indexes. 10,000 of them are on a real-time basis, which means they're published every 15 seconds. We've got real estate indexes as well. We went out of the gate on IOSCO compliant with external audit, and we're by PwC. We published our full audit statement on our website, as well as our compliance statements. So out of the gate, we were prepared and compliant and transparent with IOSCO. We want to do the same on the benchmark regulation, but with the provisions that we have, I'm afraid that some of these interpretations are making it, and I know people hate to hear the word impossible, but actually it's impossible for us to be compliant with respect to new business as of the 1st of January 2018. And it's actually stopping new business, looks like for a large part of Q1 2018 and potentially into Q2. I'll talk a little bit more about what that means, but you know that's the context in which we find ourselves today. And so I think we do need to get to a point very quickly on where we have some consistency amongst NCAs and interpretation. Just as a point of reference, MSCI is independent, as well as the colleagues at S&P Dow Jones. We don't have trading functions. We're not part of an asset manager, a bank, stock exchange, et cetera. So we are independent index providers. And let's go on to the point, going backwards, to the points discussion. So these are the points. Again, I want to talk at the end about transitional period and the definition of the EU or the definition of regulated data benchmarks. I think that's quite key. So on the discussion points, I mean, we felt with respect to the delegated acts, we felt that making available to the public, and here's where we start talking about how people are interpreting language, because we actually felt that there was a nice balance with respect to the concept of potentially indeterminate number of users being a way that folks can't get out of the regulation, because what we want to ensure is that there's a level playing field in the regulation. So the providers of indexes where our indexes are used widely shouldn't be captured, or should be captured, and that's fine for investor protection if there are products on our indexes, that makes sense. But for a provider, a self-indexer, to say, oh, I only have one index per a financial product and that's not captured, seems to be completely contradictory with the concept of investor protection. So even S&P and MSCI are taking slightly different interpretations. I think what we're looking for is to make sure that there are not loopholes in the regulation to allow self-indexing to be excluded from the regulation. I also think there is a concept of private indexes, and that was touched upon by ESMA, and that seems helpful because I think there are situations where there are private indexes under NDA not to be used in the context that would be captured by the benchmark regulation. So that's where we are on that. I think that probably needs a little bit more work. As you see, the two index providers are having different interpretations. I think administering the arrangements for the termination of benchmarks, I think that it's consistent with IOSCO. I think our main issue there was that production and maintenance of the index plus production and maintenance of the methodology are two things that need to be captured under administrating a benchmark. And I think they were referenced there. Issuance of financial instrument, I'm going to let that go because we have comments during the panel on that. I like this topic. Benchmark reference value, one word, complicated. I think ESMA was given an impossible task of trying to figure out what this meant because there was recognition across, I mean, that was the one thing everyone's unanimous, right? You can't track, you can't measure this. How do you measure this? So I think it was very helpful what ESMA came up with in guidance. I think what was particularly helpful is the fallback provisions. I think that's essential. There may be some debate on whether that's necessary or not. I think it's absolutely necessary because day to day, the industry goes to places, and it might not be the ESMA registers that the parties that the industry goes to find out what assets are tracking their own indexes. But I do think there are other providers of data where we typically go to and have more current data, more searchable data, more practical access to the data. And I think the fallback provision here is, with the specifications, very important, because I think what's going to happen over time is we give our NCAs the specification and what we're using and the sources, and over time, not day one, but over time, there will be a sense that the industry can align, because the NCAs are going to say, oh, well, this index provider got the data from there. Can everyone get the data from there? And there'll be an alignment over time. And I think the fallback provision with the specification is very helpful to encourage that to happen. So we're very much in favor of that fallback provision. We were asked to comment on critical benchmarks in the discussion points and the criteria. 2 points there. I mean, it was always our view that if an index is substitutable, by definition, it's not critical, because you can just use a different benchmark if there's an index that you don't, there's a problem with. So you can go to another benchmark. I think that if you have competitive indexes that are critical, and you start allowing NCAs in one jurisdiction to call one index critical in their market and not across the board, you have an issue with consistency, and competitive indexes are now treated differently across the business. I think that creates some issues. I also saw in level 2 that I didn't see in level 1 this concept of benchmarks being potentially able to be designated as critical just because they're used as reference in accounting standards. I'm looking at the accountant. and for prudential regulation. And I think that's pretty dangerous, and I'd like that to come out, because I'm not sure that the benchmark administrator ever got consent to that, and consent to their indexes being used by a regulator, a government body, as an accounting standard. So unless there's an ability for benchmark administrators to say, no, I don't want my index to be used in that manner to force me to be critical, then I think this is fundamentally unfair. So we'd like to see that come out or not be followed. Okay, endorsement, we were asked to comment on endorsement. I'm not sure I actually get endorsement. Maybe it would be used for a corporate, but although you have the other regimes, because I can't see a situation as it's structured where a competitor, and I'm just going to stand back from MSCI, but from a legal standpoint, where a competitor would take on the liability as the endorser for someone else's benchmarks. I can't see that. And as the party, the third country provider who needs to have their indexes endorsed, why would you give the keys to your European business to a competitor? I just don't see that working. So maybe there's some fact-specific situations that I'm not thinking about where this is going to be appropriate, but I just don't really see that happening because of the legal risks and the liability associated with that. And those were the comments, but I do want to touch on, I mean, Joe's already raised them, but I want to emphasize the 2 points on transition, the transitional period, and regulated data benchmarks. So I introduced it in the beginning, but again, I want to emphasize that the interpretation that the transitional period applies to existing benchmarks means that you have a situation where day one, even though the benchmark administrators do everything they need to do to get ready, day one for new business, benchmark administrators have to stop all new business as of day one, because there's no mechanism today, unless anyone can tell me, there's no mechanism today where day one you can be registered. So that's a really big issue. And how long that period is that you can't actually do any new business depends on who you are, what kind of administrator you are, independent, whatever, where you're located, who your regulator is, and that regulator's backlog. So you may have some regulators that have 2 benchmarks. You may have some regulators that have 200 benchmarks. And where you are in that queue is going to dictate how long you have to wait until you do business when your competitors are out there getting registered before you. And I think that's a really unfortunate consequence of this regulation. And I think the other thing, and Joe touched on this, is business, it looks like business has to be undone, right? Because you have this concept of benchmarks between 2016 and 2018, and what applies to that. Does that mean day one that business has to be unwound? Again, completely anomalous situation we have here, where the regulation is causing business to stop, new business to stop, and existing business to be unwound. And so we don't think this is necessarily a level 1 issue. We think it's an interpretation of level 1 that seems fairly anomalous, where we should allow the transition period to apply as a transition period should apply, which is grandfathering, as Joe said, existing benchmark providers, not more broadly, not limiting it to existing benchmarks. And the last point, and I'll be quick, is with respect to regulated data benchmarks, to Joe's point, never in the discussions, and we've been involved in this from day one, was it ever interpreted that regulated data benchmarks would only be EU benchmarks. It was always talked about as an asset class. Equity benchmarks need to be treated a certain way, different from the other benchmarks because you're using stock exchange data. Never ever did anyone talk about EU regulated data benchmarks get that treatment. And we have a situation now where EU regulated data benchmarks get that treatment, but frontier markets, emerging markets, many developed markets, if you look at the list of equivalents, aren't considered regulated data benchmarks. And that throws the whole, regulation into confusion. So that's it.